You're listening to The Quiet Reformation. I'm Justin Boyer here along with Tim Deering. Today on the podcast, we have Keri Ladouceur.
We have just decided we actually want to be a community that pursues justice, and that diversity will be an outflow of that. If we're just pursuing diversity for diversity's sake, there's really good things. And I think as leaders, we have to be attentive to that. But when we start talking about justice and we're aware, each one of us as individuals, of how we're stewarding our influence or our privilege or our access on behalf of other people, male, female, young, old, socioeconomic class, racial diversity, there's all sorts of ways that plays out. And that, I think, is a core discipleship question every follower of Jesus needs to wrestle with.
Keri is a pastor in the Chicagoland area and a speaker with the exponential community. She is also the founder of New Ground Network, where she coaches ministry leaders to articulate, actualize, and adapt their unique vision for participating in God's kingdom. Keri loves the creating aspect of baking and the challenge of recreating awesome foods at home. Between her and her husband and their 2 kids, there are 4 different generational languages happening, from Gen X to Gen Alpha, making for some interesting conversations in their home. We welcome Keri to The Quiet Reformation.
Hey everybody, thanks for jumping on today. It's great being with you, and I'm super pumped today because we have Keri Ladouceur with us, and she's a good friend, and I know her from school, from seminary. We're at Northern together. We get to hang out with the likes of Lynn Kohik and Scott McKnight and Jay Gupta, and we just have an awesome time learning incredible things about the Bible and about culture together. And Keri is also someone who I consider like a fellow laborer in the kingdom. We have some things in common. We have some nonprofit network stuff that we do that's similar to one another and serve in the church. And mostly, though, I just really appreciate the fact that Keri is a person who's incredibly talented and gifted, and yet even more than her talent, her gifts, and her intellect is her humility in pursuing the presence of Christ and leaning into the presence of Christ. And that makes for good ministry, but it makes for really good friendship too. So so Keri, welcome to the podcast. Awesome to have you on.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have a bunch of things that we could talk about today. And so we could go all over the place, but I want to be in our cultural moment right now. I know you've been serving pastors in churches for a while, and you've served within churches as well as a pastor. I think there's so much that's happening right now in people's minds around the church. Keri, I know you've seen people go through major theological deconstruction. We've seen that from people on highest levels of church leadership down to the farthest reaching person who had heard of Christianity or whatever. But there's been a whole lot of rethinking around faith in general. But of course, when it comes to the church, there's an enormous amount of right at the heart of why church. Is this church anymore? And what is church? And why do I need church? And how vital and how important it is right now that as we're exploring the different ways of kind of doing and being church, that we still stay interconnected and in relationship, in conversation, so that the Lord can be working among us. Do you find right now, I know your heart is for unity and connection and relationship and covenant across the wider body of Christ. Do you find right now that that's a spot that is open, where people are more willing to partner and be connected with the wider body of Christ? Or do you see greater challenges right now? I'd love to hear your perspective on what you're experiencing through New Ground and Exponential on that level.
Yeah. It's such a good question. And I think there's both happening right now. Mm-hmm. I do think in some senses there is like a competitiveness that can come out in this season when we're in, and I think that's really natural in a season of scarcity for people. I also, with some of the networks that I work with and churches that I work with, like there is a real longing and openness to connect for mission in new ways that I have not seen before. sometimes it's around specific things. And that's some of even what we're experiencing here. I could kind of share a story about that. But I have a real, I lose sleep at night about sort of the witness of the church in the West.
Yeah.
I'm very aware of the witness of the church in the West, of what people who don't know Jesus imagine evangelicals to be because of what they see on the news. I'm very aware of just the pain of how we represent Christ right now. We should be ambassadors for the kingdom. And I think we have a lot of, I hate this term, but we have a lot of PR work to do there. We have a lot of reestablishing who we are as Christ ambassadors. And so I think there's a ton of potential in this when churches could actually, even with very different belief systems, come together around the one or two things, that they have in common, primarily that Jesus is the head of them as a church. I think there's a ton of opportunity. And I am seeing some churches seize that in really powerful and unique ways in this season.
I believe that the integrity issue for us, we obviously both, one of the things that we get to share is learning from Scott McKnight. And, he's consistently been blowing a trumpet for integrity in church leadership. Latest book with Tove, really calling us to moral integrity in how we handle things internally. But there's also a level of integrity in the PR side of things that you're talking about, which has to do with, does the gospel message actually reveal itself across the wider body of Christ in how we relate to one another? And there's a question of, does the container match the message? Does the messenger match the message? And one of the things that I think has been a blaring horn in our faces constantly is, can we actually justify sectarianism and tribalism in the church that has existed, really accelerating over the last 500 years, right, since the Protestant Reformation? And what is it that we can do now in this day and age to more effectively turn that ship the other direction? I think we all agree that the Protestant Reformation was really important to get our soteriology right and to get our theology and doctrine in order, and really focused on the things of the moral integrity of the church. But now that container doesn't match the message. So if you have a story, or if you have principles that you're working on, or things that you would share, we would love to hear it.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so many things come to mind. So I'm trying to take some notes here. I know pre-pandemic, I was at dinner with a group of pastors, and we were with Keri Ladouceur, who does a lot of leadership coaching and pastor out in Canada. And we were talking about this particular thing of in a predominantly Christian culture, we had all these different denominations pop up, right? And you can sort of define yourself by how you're different, or how your beliefs are in a different place, or really based on disagreements. All of these different denominations and groups popped up. And in a post-Christian culture, the church has to be known for what it's for and not how it's different or what it's against, or we lose the game. That right there in and of itself, if we can't actually set those differences aside, if we can actually decide to not be known by those distinguishing things, but to be known by the unity of what we're for, that's a game changer just in terms of the potential that we have. It becomes a winsome witness, right? And not maybe the present politically tied ideological witness that the church has in this particular moment. I had this conversation. I did some stuff with pastors and planters at Wheaton College a couple months ago, and just said, I think if you step back from the landscape of what has been happening, the church growth model or church growth mindset, for good or for bad, that changed the landscape of the church in the West, right? And I think for a long time, we could really celebrate. It was well-intentioned to invite tons of people to show up to church and cross the line of faith, right? Whatever that means. We watered down, we diluted what the gospel was for the sake of salvation, to get a bunch of people saved, good or bad, right? There's been consequences that have come from that. I don't want to judge motivations. Maybe there's been really good stuff that's come from that, but that era, it did something, it accomplished something for us. And I think right now in this moment, marketing is a really great example of this when I made the PR statement. So, 10, 12 years ago, people would pay millions or billions of dollars for billboards and for ads on Super Bowl commercials. And right, like that was the way of reaching people. That has completely shifted in the last couple of years. And now the lip gloss company is going to hire Kim Kardashian to be a brand ambassador for their product, right? They're going to pay her a couple $1 million to like post about it on Instagram and model this lifestyle that represents what they want consumers to believe they're going to get. This same shift has happened in the church, right? We could have a really compelling, comedic, articulate, entertaining pastor give a message for 20 or 30 minutes, and that did something 10 or 12 years ago. Right now, our brand ambassadors are the Christians that are walking around day in and day out interacting with people. And I think we have to wrestle with, did this diluting of discipleship, this diluting of the gospel, like this is where it has gotten us. And we have responsibility or ownership in that. I don't want to say that to point a finger. Like as a pastor, I have responsibility in kind of what my ministry is producing, but we have to wrestle with that because those people are walking billboards for what it means to be a Christian, right? And walking representation of who Jesus is. And so we have to stop. And like this shift has happened, and it should really drive then how are we engaging what we do? Like it is what kind of present day Christendom looks like in the average person's life. Is that an accurate brand representation? Or, is that the product of what we're really inviting people into, like life to the full and whole, healed, integrated people and healthy, thriving family systems that are overcoming trauma and combating addiction and working through abuse and like changing generational cycles and people that are experiencing flourishing because of their mutuality? Like if we really step back and say, what is the lifestyle of a Christian and how compelling that should be to a watching world? Like this is the gap now that we have to figure out. How do we seize that in this moment and moving forward in the church?
Hey everybody, this is Dolph. I help with building communities in different regions for Netzer. Netzer is an IRS-recognized 501c3 organization. We've been working on spiritual reformation for the church in Southeastern Pennsylvania for the past decade. Part of what we do is encourage pastors individually, as well as in cohorts, to understand more fully what it means to be one body in Christ, as well as the impact that can have as they think missionally about their local communities. Please consider investing into the ministry of Netzer by going to Netzer.Org/donate. That website, once again, is Netzer.Org/donate.
There's the individual ambassadors that are those who participate in the church and are out there. And then there's the broader picture of the church. And you were touching on both of those things, right? So how we as the broader church relate to one another speaks to, do we have integrity with this message? And then we as individuals each carry that. So I want to ask a question about each of those things. On the broader level of unity in the church, and how if the gospel is a gospel that reconciles not only us to God, but us to one another, to the extent that we can focus on what we have in common, not what we have apart, is essential to your point. And I mean, this is like so at the core of my heart, that. But let me just drop a heavy question in the middle of that, because there's also things that we hold near and dear that we think the church needs to grow in, that are places where we have differences with other people, and we think they're important differences. So Keri, like there's people who are complementarians who, right, don't believe in women taking any sort of leadership in the church. By definition, that puts them in opposition to your very position, right? And your leadership. What does it look like for you when you're in a spot where you're like, you love the Lord, you're chasing after God and going after the call he's got on your life, and you're really working at unity, but you find yourself in places where your existence of your call and your ministry, it's like, okay, how do you navigate that on a unity level and yet still hold to your convictions? It's seriously humbling to ask you this question. And And at the beginning of the podcast, when I said what I most value about you is the fact that you got all these chops, but then you also just try to stay in tune with the Spirit. I wouldn't ask this question from you unless I just really respect how you walk this out yourself.
Thank you for that. I mean, it comes with a cost, right? Like unity comes with a cost, and it requires all of us to lay something down. And so when that means partnering with men like J.D. Greer, a couple months ago, we taught at a conference together, right? And he was thrown under the bus and I was thrown under the bus. I was called a pastor in quotation marks, and he was like, called out by SBC people for even being willing to share a stage with quote unquote women pastors. Like it comes at a cost. And so personally, and I have had to wrestle this one to the ground in so many different arenas. He's a friend who doesn't actually affirm my role in ministry, but I don't need him to validate that. It's really not why I do it. Right. Like Jesus called me to this. I have nothing to gain, nothing to lose, nothing to earn, nothing to prove. And so I can show up. And that's like my motto, like my mantra when I show up in these spaces, because so often, and this happens in really explicit ways and in really like microaggressive ways, right? Like there's microaggression. Like I am aware when people are bothered by my presence in those spaces, and I choose how to respond to that. And there's a time that those really triggered me or were really hard, and they still take a lot of energy, like how I care for myself on the other side, really matters. But when I'm able to kind of hold space for people who are working through that, or who are wrestling through that, or like even people in my church, when I got hired for this role that had questions, like if I'm going to be triggered, I can't be a safe place for them to process. If I'm going to pastor them and kind of set my own emotions about this or my own stuff around this topic aside and just hold space for their questions, we might actually move in this conversation. So I know that's a little bit outside of the unity part of it, but I know it cost some of those guys something. We hosted a conference at our church in November, and there were men who were complementary men who were like speakers at the conference. And I knew that going into it. And I knew some of them might not make eye contact with me in the green room. And I knew some of them would be like, whoa, wait, you lead this church? Like and so I have to kind of prepare myself on the front end for how that's going to be. And for the sake of mission, it was worth it. It's worth it to share those stages. And I think sometimes it really kind of scrambles their eggs, right? To experience me in a way that's different than maybe they anticipated, or the story they told themselves about women in a position like this, or, so I can still call these guys my brothers. I don't need them to endorse or validate this part of who I am, but sometimes they have to make space for me. And I know that costs them something too, or that is uncomfortable, or that is a sacrifice some of them choose to make as well. So I think we meet around the table of mission and share that table with Christ, and kind of have to set some of those things aside where they belong.
Man, I so appreciate that. And I think when I picture this, we have two teenage boys, and they're only a year and a half apart, just over a year apart. And, they wouldn't necessarily gravitate toward one another at school to become friends if they weren't brothers. Right. But what it looks like to get along at home and live reconciled together, it means that there's space that they don't get complete control over that space. There's a lot of things that they have to share. And I think that one of the messages that has been so important for us has been the fact that there is actually only, when we're told in Ephesians 4 that there's only one body, we're also told there's only one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And when it says there's only one baptism, that's the sign of the covenant, which means there's only one covenant. There's one table of fellowship. There's one water that we all enter into. And so we've been, one of the things we've been working on is in all of our pastors groups that gather together and work geographically to function together, we've been putting together a document that is about navigating various levels of tension theologically. So how do you when you're dealing with a a pastor's group, a clergy group that might be interfaith, there's going to be one level of conversation. Yeah. Then when you're dealing with something that comes under the banner of Christendom, but you're dealing with issues that you might consider to be orthodoxy issues, how do we handle those issues? And then the next one is the tense one. The next one is like vital hermeneutical issues, right? Where we're dealing with things, we interpret the Bible very different, and yet we hold the authority of scriptures extremely high, and we're all within the banner of Orthodox Christianity. And then what does it look like to live in that covenant together, like my boys in their home, in their family? But yet we have very different perspectives, and we're part of one covenant. And I just want to reiterate this. I really value how I see you walking this out, and there's so much grace and so much patience, because in Ephesians 4, it says, let's walk in a manner worthy of the calling, in order that we can do everything within our power to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. And the way we walk that out is with great humility and patience. And it takes a long time for us to figure out how to get along when we're seeing things from various perspectives. You're walking that out. It's awesome. And I appreciate that.
Thanks. I thank you. I appreciate that. And I receive that. I respect you so much. And so it carries a lot of weight, and it's not without cost. I mean, it's hard, and I'm consistently trying to ask the Spirit, what is faithfulness in this? Because there are times that it's worth saying something about, right? Yeah. There are times like, if an environment is not hospitable to women, if it's hostile to women, maybe even in unintentional ways, sometimes the fact that I'm there gives me credibility and influence to call that out or to say something. And sometimes that's in a private conversation directly with the leader, right? The article that somebody in the SBC wrote, I really, really wrestled with, do I say something? Do I not say something? And I was driving down the road and felt like the Spirit gave me exact words to say. And so I addressed some of the ways that we write people off, like to say that women in leadership is a low view of Scripture. Listen, I can respect that you have a different view, that you have a different lens, that you have a different interpretation of these texts. But to call it a low view of Scripture is really kind of like, that's a low blow. You're just writing it off. Yeah. It's actually a really high view of Scripture because of the amount of historical and contextual work I've done to get to this place. So let's at least agree that we can see one another and respect one another. So I address some of those just narratives that we use that I think are dangerous on any topic, right? When we can write off those people or try to justify or rationalize sort of our view, I mean, that's going to stand in the way of unity on any topic, right? I don't eat meat. Like if we're going to talk about being a vegetarian or drinking or at any time, that's more of like a personhood pattern that we fall into that's harmful. And so all to say, like, there are moments that I wrestle with, is this okay? Am I acquiescing or accommodating something that is fundamentally a wrestling point for me on the gospel? Because I've seen how the fruit can be rotten from a complementarian tree. That's not to say that it is all the time, but I mean, that we've seen that even in recent years. So it is a tension to manage, not a problem to solve, but it feels like a real honor to get to enter into those spaces and hopefully an honoring way.
One of the ways that we frame this, and that I think is really important that you were talking about this, is there's a time where the prophetic, we call it the prophetic, like the confrontation or the accountability. When we think about the prophetic, it tends to be like, you picture that Old Testament prophet, like calling out, like, this is not okay. Yeah. You see John the Baptist, like, you brood of vipers, who warned you about the wrath that's coming, and that the apostolic tends to be that like it has the vision where God's painting a vision and it's bringing things together from that frame of mind. But then the prophetic's more accountability and confrontation. And there's a moment where it's going to make the comfortability like squeal a little bit and squirm. And yet we're like, we can be all on the same page, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. But if we're it's going to be the lowest common denominator if there isn't also accountability. Instead of saying, what do we most agree on that is our highest value, is how we live together around the gospel. There are values that need to be upheld even when there are convictions that can't be shared. There are still values that need to be upheld. And so then we need prophetic accountability around those values. And I hear you saying that, and I so appreciate that. It's awesome. We have two more questions to wrap things up. Justin's going to ask you one in a second, but I said there was two things I wanted to ask you about. One was about, as the church, how we relate to one another in a way that brings integrity, but then as individuals going from congregations and being ambassadors out there, the question for me is, as people are shaped by the gospel, how important is the role of diversity in the community of Christ for that, for the shaping of individuals, and how do you help foster that in the spaces that you're in?
Yeah. So I think when we wrestle the full implication of the gospel to the ground, diversity is obviously a really important part of God's kingdom. It's a really important part of the body. It's a really important part of what we see unfold in the New Testament of this new family that God is creating. Super practically speaking, there's one thing I would love to promote too, but we have just decided if we pursue diversity for the sake of diversity, diverse people on stage, right? Like that's a first step. So people who don't look like me walk in and see people who look like them, right? Diversity around leadership circles, right? Like that's another, okay, how do we have decisions that are actually being made and informed by a diverse perspective? We are really intentional even about like resources for our writing team. You know, we're consistently trying to have broader voices shape what we do and what commentaries we look at and what kind of theologians we're listening to, what kind of art, you know, we're attentive to. But all of those things are good. We have just decided we actually want to be a community that pursues justice, and that diversity will be an outflow of that. If we're just pursuing diversity for diversity's sake, there's really good things. And I think as leaders, we have to be attentive to that. But when we start talking about justice and we're aware, each one of us of individuals, of how we're stewarding our influence or our privilege or our access on behalf of other people, male, female, young, old, socioeconomic class, racial diversity, there's all sorts of ways that plays out. And that, I think, is a core discipleship question every follower of Jesus needs to wrestle with. American status on your passport or not. Like all of us carry a level of influence or privilege or access that has to be stewarded on behalf of the oppressed among us. So I think that's a really important discipleship question. And we are saying, as a church community, then what does it look like for us to be a people pursuing justice together? And that's with other churches, with other denominations, like that, we feel like is the core part of our mission. And diversity becomes a really fantastic outflow of actually pursuing justice, because then we're aware of the privilege that we are called to steward. We're aware of the injustices that other people face because of their social location. And we're asking the question, what does it mean that we need to do to be active participants in pursuing justice together? Then we're a safe place for a whole wide diverse group of people. And that just becomes a natural outflow of our pursuit of justice more than just diversity.
So the motivation is toward justice because that's at the heart of God. Diversity is an outflow. I also probably, if we had time and I pressed in more, I think I would also hear you saying that diversity is an essential quality in the discovery of what justice actually looks like. So we need the manifold wisdom of God, and that we're not going to hear that in our own echo chambers. So we do have to pursue diversity from a learning standpoint of how do we learn what justice is. We need other voices to help us learn that. And
that's a hard, bumpy, clunky kind of journey. There's some experiences I highly recommend that I think can help people on that journey. I do think this particular cultural moment, like this isn't new. Race relations and injustices are not new. It's something people are newly paying attention to. And it is, very divisive and polarizing right now, right? And so some people think that we're talking about it because it's a cultural issue. And it's like, no, this is a core implication of the gospel. And we have to allow those kind of lenses that culture might be giving us to fall away and say, what is our role in this? And I actually think the church is the only community that is poised to have any real influence in this area. And so this is like one of the key opportunities for us as the church in the West in this moment is to be ambassadors of reconciliation and carry a ministry of reconciliation. If we can figure this out, the church shines in the ways that she should, and in a way that people are so desperate for right now. I will tell you a quick story. Sorry, I know we have 2 more questions.
Come on.
I was flying to DC to speak at a conference back in September. And it was the first time I've been on a plane in a while. And you know that question when somebody next to you wants to talk and they're like, so what do you do? And usually when I say pastor, it shuts down the conversation.
Right. Yeah.
And I had a little bit more work to do on my talk. And so I was like, oh, I'm a pastor. And this guy was like, what? What? You're a woman. Like he was totally thrown for a loop and totally no filter about like why he thought that was so weird. And he's like, well, what are you doing? I'm like, well, I'm going to speak at this conference right now. It's other pastors and I'm going to go. He's like, what are you talking about? And I was like, well, actually unity. Like the whole point of my talk is to talk about unity and how big is your circle. And I was like, yeah, isn't it kind of funny? They put that on me to talk about, we're just like having a good conversation. And he's like, well, what kind of unity? Like, what do you actually, like, he was just totally thrown.
Yeah.
And I told him one of the things that we are talking about is, racial justice. And I told him about this thing that we're doing right now called Undivided at our church, where you're gathering people of very diverse backgrounds. It's like a 6-week kind of experience that you walk through. It's very immersive. It's theological at its core about why this is a core part of the gospel, but it's really practical too, just eye-opening, about how privilege works and about your social location and about the stories that you've maybe told yourself of people of diverse backgrounds. It's a phenomenal experience. I highly recommend it. So I start telling him like, well, this is one of the things as a church. And this guy, not a follower of Jesus, was like, I am flying home from Chicago. I just met with some of my buddies from high school because some of them are Black and we are trying to figure out what are we supposed to do? Like, what are we supposed to do right now for our kids? And he's like, I cannot believe that the church is further along in this conversation. Like, I cannot believe it. And so he wants to join Undivided with us online. I'm like, there's going to be some church stuff. Like you're totally welcome to come. You're going to hear some of the stuff we believe, but like we're seeing fruit come from this and how people spend their money and how people engage their free time and how people shop right now. We started something called justice deposits, where we are actually recapitalizing Black-owned banks because they are the ones that help support Black-owned businesses getting started. And so we're moving funds. Like there's real practical things that are coming, but evangelistically speaking, this guy had never even wanted to know more about Jesus in his life until he heard that followers of Jesus were working on this thing that he sees as very broken in the world, and he feels helpless and ill-equipped to try to solve, but he cares about it. And so that underscored for me, like, yes, there is so much redemptive potential if the church can engage in this justice-oriented conversation right now.
Yeah.
So you said earlier, Keri, about like it would be nice if the church was a safe place and that the church was filled with justice. But oftentimes the church is messy no matter what. And oftentimes people can experience trauma from the church, whether it's the institution or people who are following Jesus imperfectly, as we all do. I was just wondering, as a coach, whether it's to other church leaders or nonprofit leaders, or to maybe it's not even leaders, just people in general, how have you helped coach others through kind of the trauma of church life, being able to process their pain, but also trying to hold on to their faith in the midst of that kind of trauma?
Yes, we could definitely talk about this one for 2 more hours too, Justin, because this is such a prevalent thing that I think is really tied to even the racial reconciliation conversation. I think is very tied to the difficult sort of pastoral moment for church leaders. I think this is why we're seeing so many leaders resign. There's also, from a like neuroscience and psychology, there's so much new information about trauma. I don't know if most people even know exactly what trauma is, but it's any sort of experience that overwhelms your mind's ability to deal with it, right? Sometimes trauma is related to abuse. Sometimes trauma is related to a loss. We have all walked through trauma in the last 2 years. I think we have not even begun to see the consequences of. And all of us, to varying degrees throughout our childhoods, have experienced trauma, right? Sometimes this comes from childhood wounds, from family of origin, from a knee injury in college playing football that changed the trajectory of your life, right? Like trauma comes, little t trauma and big T trauma comes in all sorts of ways. I think the more we learn about trauma in neuroscience and psychology and in culture, which is a very hot topic right now, the more responsible we have to be in the church when it comes to trauma. I learned a lot about this walking through a really traumatic time for me at the hands of church leaders. I was just devastatingly betrayed, and that shattered this paradigm that I had of what the church was, and this paradigm that I didn't even realize then that sort of cast a shadow on who I experienced God to be. And so we have a responsibility to be aware of kind of the impact of how we're engaging, like that, as an organization, as leaders in the church, and to be able to pastor people and really care for people well. I think there's a ton of responsibility there. I think personally and individually, each one of us on our journey of emotional, mental, spiritual health have a responsibility to be aware of our own trauma and how different things get triggered in us that, lead to emotional responses in the moment. Like there's the real individual layer of work that each one of us should be doing. I think the consequences of many of us not doing that work are what's playing out right now, and the challenges of trying to pastor responsibly.
Yeah.
And then I think another kind of layer of that is I learned from Diane Langberg, who is like a brilliant psychologist and has done a lot of work with abuse survivors and also people who were abusers. But she talks about our responsibility as the church to be a resource and a refuge. And so when we're in a message talking about something, when we're telling stories in a video, when we're addressing things like sexuality in the church, anytime we're talking about a topic that has the potential to trigger somebody's trauma, there's a way in which we should be able to speak about it and talk about it that doesn't do more harm with how we're talking about. So I think this need for how to do responsible trauma-informed ministry is going to continue to grow for us as church leaders, as well as sort of this need as pastors and individuals for us to do our work. And as we do our own work in the area, I think we're able to create safety for people to engage in that kind of deeper work.
Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is DJ Martin. I serve as the church pastor at Prophetic Church in the Pottstown area. I've been hugely blessed by Netzer's ministry over the past decade as I've served in vocational ministry in various settings, particularly since I've been leading a couple of different churches as lead pastor. Netzer has been a place where I've built community and relationships. Netzer has a focus on church for church leaders that has had a huge impact on my life and ministry, especially through their cohort ministry. I help lead the local cohort here in the Pottstown area, and the relationships and connections, friendships I've built over the years and have been built for me through the cohort ministry have been amazing. And I've certainly grown and been strengthened and challenged by these relationships over the years. We all know how isolating and difficult ministry can be at times, and Netzer's emphasis and focus on church for church leaders has been a source of strength and encouragement for me. I hope that you get involved in Netzer in whatever ways you can in the coming season of ministry in your own life.
I want to ask you, One of the things we like to do at the end of the podcast is just share any story of how we've seen the Lord work in our life. Ask our guests to share what's an encouraging story of how you've seen the Lord work and how he's impacted you or those you serve. So you have anything that maybe you can share with us that might be encouraging to the listeners?
Yes. I hope that it will be encouraging. But the story that I was thinking of telling is,
if not, we'll just cut it.
yeah. The place that I experienced God more than any other time in my life was in the ditch, was in the wilderness after this really difficult betrayal by church leaders, betrayal even from my church community at that time. I had never before that been given any idea of like a theology of suffering, right? Or what it means to live a cruciform life, to follow Christ to the cross. And this kind of wounding that happened was a trauma that I navigated. But on the other side of that, I think what happened, and we didn't even talk about deconstruction, but on the heels of what I just said about trauma, I think some of those threads of this faith tradition I had been handed got pulled in that hard season. And in some ways, like the whole thing starts to unravel when you start pulling on those threads. And I walked through like a dark night of the soul, like wandering through the wilderness. There were days I didn't want to live anymore. Like it was a really, really hard season as this kind of foundation that I thought was pretty reliable just completely crumbled underneath me. But I found the presence of God in the midst of the pain like I never had before. I was kind of slowly became aware of all these ways I had avoided pain or numbed it or distracted from it, right? Like all the ways I had accommodated my life up until that point didn't work anymore. But I experienced the nearness and the closeness and the presence of God. Like Psalm 34:18 talks about how God is near to the brokenhearted. Like I have never experienced a more intimate time with God than that season of walking through the wilderness. And what I came out of that season with was a much more durable faith than I walked into it with. And so I think all of us to varying degrees right now are walking through some different dark nights of the soul, some different wilderness type seasons, whether you're a pastor, whether you're a Christ follower, whether you're in the midst of deconstruction. And so I just think there are no questions that are too big for God. There are no words that are too bad for God to say to him. I mean, when you can fully in your whole self show up to the struggle and the wrestling and the pain, God will meet you there every single time. And you stay there as long as you need to. You stay in that as long as you need to. And the repair and the mending and the healing work that God can do there is just not like anything else you'll ever experience.
Well, thank you, Keri. Leadership and leadership development have been front and center for you for a long time when it comes to caring for other people. But as you talk about this and the journey that you've been on, and even the question we asked about where do pastors need to be focusing on, everything about that just speaks to the fact that the greatest level of leadership happens as we follow Christ with everything we have. My friend, it is awesome to be on that journey with you and to watch you leading people by you chasing Christ with everything you got. And really glad that through various pain that you've stayed on the journey and drawn closer, and we're all better for it. So thank you. We love you. And we're really grateful for you as a sister and as a friend.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it was a real privilege to join you guys. Thanks for what you're doing to continue to equip pastors and leaders and followers too. I love your work and I'm so grateful for it.
Give ear to my prayer, God. Do not hide from my cries. Give heed with your answer. For I'm overwhelmed, I'm overwhelmed. My heart, it keeps pounding inside of my chest. The tears of death around me, fear surrounding, and I can't stop from trailing. Oh, had I wings, had I wings, had I wings, I would fly away and find a place to rest. Oh, had I wings, had I wings, had I wings, I could find some quiet in this wilderness. But cast your burden on the Lord, and He'll sustain you yet again. Oh, cast your burden on the Lord, and He'll sustain you yet again.